So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So hi everyone, I'm Colleen. I'm the Digital Engagement Manager at Beyond the Bomb. And Beyond the Bomb is a people-powered grassroots movement to reduce the threat of nuclear violence. So yeah, I've been a campaigner for like 6-ish years, doing a lot of digital work, mainly on issues of foreign policy and national security. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it over to Tabo to get us started.
So hi everyone, I'm Intebo. I work at Daily Kos as a digital campaigner as well. And my background comes from field organizing, especially around voting rights and worker solidarity. So I'm very excited to be here with y'all. I use she and they pronouns, and we are both based in the DC area. So really happy to be with y'all virtually and hope everyone's holding up okay as we enter the last session of the day. So before we get into the presentation, just wanted to honor the land that we are presenting from. We are presenting on unceded or stolen Piscataway land. And so the land here is Piscataway land. It is, not ours, we are guests. And Piscataway folks, traditional ancestral homelands are, the DC, Maryland, Virginia region, and are actually the largest tribe in the Mid-Atlantic region. And right now there's a really beautiful language revival movement amongst Piscataway folks. And there are a lot of great campaigns that Piscataway folks are running to hold on to their land and culture, including resisting deforestation of the Nanjemoy Forest in Southern Maryland, as well as the recent NFL victory coming on the heels of a very successful culture jamming campaign, pushing us to question why we would have a racist football team name. And so that recently has changed thanks to the work of Piscataway folks and allies, as well as Native folks from the Plains region as well. So shout out to that. And then again, we also know that displacement of Black folks is not happening in DC. We know gentrification is hitting a lot of cities across the country and arguably the world. And I myself am a descendant of enslaved folks from the region, and we know that folks were actually sold on the National Mall. And so as we move into this presentation about digital and field and organizing and building people power, it's really important for us to recognize the legacy and the historic and continued violence against Black and Brown people and Indigenous people in the US, and must be mindful of that as we continue to fight for equal rights and for, a better world. And along that same note, we of course have to acknowledge the moment we're in. We're experiencing a really hard time. Y'all know, we're experiencing mass death in many respects from the pandemic, from neglect of the federal government, from displacement, from racist immigration practices, and we're also experiencing an uprising against police violence. Many of us are suffering from intergenerational trauma, but at the same time, from that trauma, a lot of beautiful flowers have bloomed. We're seeing people take back power. We see people creating new monuments. We see folks resisting violence. We see people cultivating joy. We see Black joy. We see mutual aid. So that's the energy that is, life-giving, and that's the world we want to build. And I'm excited to model that with y'all today. So yeah.
Yeah, so an overview of the session. So the main takeaway from this will be that digital organizing is field organizing. And so we'll kind of use those terms and kind of define some of these terms as well and demystify jargon. And we're going to help you build a toolkit, see what is basically out there and how to use a little bit of it. So using like storytelling, developing calls to action. But yeah, main takeaway is digital organizing is field organizing. So before we kind of get into some of these like tools and tactics, we also want to acknowledge that the digital space is pretty exclusive. So we would just want to kind of ground that in the exclusion from digital.
Yeah, so we know that this digital space has been historically dominated by white, cis, and hetero men. And we are happy to not be a panel of white cis het men. And we're excited to, build with y'all and move from, racist hiring practices and disinvestment of, digital workers of color, trans digital workers, women digital workers. We're really excited to move away from that and actually talk about how to address digital exclusion from digital.
Yeah, so just touching on a few ways to address this are removing education requirements from job descriptions, investing in new leaders, which means like providing trainings, learning from others' experiences as well as our own experiences, principles of mutual aid and community building existing within your organization. So that means resource sharing and uplifting each other, and demystifying jargon, which, like I said, we're going to cover a little bit later in this presentation. But just being careful about the terms we use and that they can be pretty exclusive and pretty like it just doesn't include a lot of people when you're using these like high terms that like not a lot of people may be familiar with.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about aligning digital and field tactics. And yeah, here we go. So once again, if you've filled out the form, great. If you haven't, there's the link again, and Colleen has already dropped it in the chat. I'll just give you like 1 minute to see if we can fill it out, and we're gonna try to drop in some of that data into the presentation live. You are seeing our skills in practice. Cool. Are you ready for me to move? Good, okay. Oop. Hold on a sec, oops. Let's see. Here we are, okay, so one of our questions, as you know, was about what does your operation look like? Is it heavily dominated by digital tactics, field, both, none of the above? Looks like no one said none of the above. And we have a good distribution of, wow, y'all are so aligned. That's great. So we're excited to, strategize with y'all. Again, if you haven't dropped where you are coming from, please drop that in the chat. We want to be as interactive as possible. And it's really helpful for us to know where everyone's at. And I've noticed there's a nice distribution of, issue areas covered amongst the folks who are in the in this webinar, as well as labor. So very excited. Sit tight. So again, aligning digital and field is very important to us. We see it as strategic, as important. As we know, there is the term the ladder of engagement. Arguably, this ladder of engagement applies whether you're employing digital or field tactics. We begin with recruiting, engaging, and then activating and mobilizing. Activating can also be the enraged stage as you educate folks about your issue and why power needs to shift. And so for us, What is really important from the beginning is to be in communication with one another. So that means whether that means your organization actually has two different departments, one's field and one's digital, and you're working on the same campaign, conversations and strategy and power mapping, all of that needs to happen together from the beginning. If you are working in coalition with other organizations that say your org really specializes in using digital tactics, then being in community with and in coalition with organizations or grassroots groups that employ field tactics, it's really important to strategize together so that way the tactics complement each other and aren't necessarily duplicative or harming one another. Again, power mapping. This is a strategy that is traditionally something you do in a field organizing setting, but it really applies to both because you need to know where power sits, how power can move ahead of any sort of campaign. So again, being flexible, thinking about important dates in your campaign, thinking about anniversaries, thinking about holidays, different points of engagement that can really activate your base. And again, being flexible, being clear, being communicative, and making sure that your campaign can move with the people, because while there is the ladder of engagement, sometimes someone might enter in what you thought was the activation stage, but also might be the recruitment stage for someone who, say, received a petition from someone else. So making sure your language meets people wherever they're at is really important. And again, can't emphasize enough that digital diversity and accessibility are both strategic. What we're trying to do here together is to build power amongst the people and to shift power away from, wealthy billionaires, from members of Congress who might not align with you. And so the best and most strategic way to do that is to include as many people in your campaign, and especially folks who live in the margins.
Yes, so true. So yeah, talking a little bit more about this using a case study. So this is 350.org, and this is actually a really unique case because a few years ago, they actually just basically got rid of their digital department. And instead, they're spreading digital responsibilities throughout their whole organization. And there's a really interesting article on Mob Lab, which is a great resource that I'll talk about later as well. Just talking about kind of this shift, and I just put that in the chat. So at 350, and I really think that a lot of us should pay attention to what 350.org is doing. Like they saw that digital is no longer a super useful distinction because it's not really a skill set. It requires so many different skills across departments. And there's no longer such a thing as offline. Like everything is online, especially in the midst of this pandemic, but even before the pandemic, there wasn't such a thing as offline anymore. Like all organizers must be adept at using these digital tools. And I'll kind of get into some of the details later and use some other case studies, but I think this is a really unique example from 350.org that I would suggest checking out. Then we can move to the next slide. And so yeah, getting more into this, digital is not really a strategy. Like you start from your strategy and your theory of change. So what is your objective? What are your goals that you're trying to reach? And then what tactics fit into that strategy and what will help you reach those goals? And then what digital tools will be a part of those tactics? So knowing how digital fits into strategies for all types of campaigns is crucial for success. And I do want to stress that time and resources are lost when these strategies and these tactics are not aligned. So whether you are hired for digital organizing, like I'm technically like the digital manager at Beyond the Bomb, like whether you're doing digital specific, whether you're doing field, like digital tactics have to be used, and you have to kind of understand the interplay among all of these because we don't want to lose those precious time and resources. then we can move to the next case study, and I'm going to be talking about Beyond the Bomb, which is where I currently work. So breaking down a little bit of Beyond the Bomb's theory of change. So our goal, our like overarching goal, is to pass no first use legislation in Congress by 2021. So no first use would commit the US to never launching a nuclear first strike. So how are we going to do this? So there's kind of 4 buckets of how we are working to do this. So organizing, we're empowering activists to organize locally and build the political power we need to force these elected officials to take a side in this fight. We're using media, we're educating the public and holding politicians and corporations accountable for their actions. Mobilizing, we're calling on elected officials to take action. And then intersectional partnerships. We're partnering with sister movements working for justice nationally, but more importantly, we're listening and taking leadership from frontline communities who are most impacted by nuclear violence. So essentially, like everything that we do at Beyond the Bomb, we stop and think, like, how does this help us reach our goal of passing no first use legislation by 2021? Like how does this blog post, how does this tweet, how does this one partnership, like how is that going to help us reach our goal? And so kind of dividing it up by departments, like we do have leads on digital, on field, on partnerships, but all of these teams have digital responsibilities. And part of this is, and talking about like the 350 example a little bit is also interesting. And for me, like I've seen that digital communications can mean something completely different depending on the organization you're at. And a lot of digital teams, they'll have like just so many responsibilities. Like you're not only like managing digital platforms, like whatever email, like content management, their customer relation manager, like whatever you're using for that, all the social media platforms, your website, like there's so many things to manage on top of sometimes even being like tech support, and then stepping back and doing like long-term strategic planning. Like digital departments can be so overwhelmed. And not only that, like when we are not aligned across those departments with field digital partnerships, like I said before, like when you're so siloed, you're wasting those resources, and it can lead to burnout for digital people. So that's why at Beyond the Bomb, like this volunteer recruitment and engagement and these partnership tactics are integrated in and backed up by online tactics and vice versa. So like we all have to be skilled in certain digital, in all of the digital kind of tools that we use. And I know personally, like our field team builds a lot of emails and is a lot of, does a lot of like the strategic thinking on that. And I know if it was like just me and my team, like it would not only be just like way too much to handle, but we wouldn't really be grounded in how to reach our goals because we wouldn't be aligned and we'd be wasting those time and resources. So yeah, I think we can move on to the digital tools and tactics section.
There's a little SpongeBob for you. Yeah, so again, in the interest of being accessible and transparent, we want to demystify some jargon. And so you've heard us allude, these are probably words you've seen, but might not necessarily know what they mean. Right now, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to do my best to actually explain what they are instead of using unnecessary words, as well as I will avoid using acronyms. Yeah, so here we go. So there are different tools for aligning digital and field. As Colleen mentioned, a lot of digital folks can be burnt out because they're managing a lot of things. All things online are given to digital departments, and sometimes you even have comms responsibilities. So you're also managing press lists, writing press releases, managing your members, your lists, etc. So for some of you, that might be your experience at work. And so right now, I'm going to go into a little bit about the different digital tools that you have that can actually complement the in-person aspect of organizing. And again, our worlds are intertwined. And so, some of the distinction, we don't necessarily experience it. Your members aren't necessarily experiencing separate lives. So that's something to keep in mind as you're organizing your campaigns. And yeah, so your email list, again, a lot of groups that are shifting power in really meaningful ways actually don't have email lists, but for those of us who do work with orgs that have email lists, this is a longer format of engaging your members. 3 to 5 paragraphs. You can really get into your issue. You can talk about power and how power is situated in a certain example. For instance, I'll talk a little bit about this case study, but for the Essential Worker Bill of Rights, for me, writing emails about this, I need to show folks what is actually happening right now for essential workers. Why is it wrong? And what can we do to change that? So some of that should be in your emails. This is where you can do a lot more deep political education, as well as, other tactics, including, webinars. And so it's important to have a clear call to action when you are using emails. Again, I mentioned you might say that, hey, this is where I'm trying to engage my base, but sometimes that might be where people are entering your campaign. So it's really important to have clear calls to action and make sure that everyone knows what you're talking about instead of assuming knowledge. For instance, I work a lot on immigration issues, and a lot of that is really jargony, and I have to remember that not everyone knows what temporary protected status is or what DACA means, and so it's really important to actually explain what you're talking about. Again, another feature with email is that you can test more elements, you can test images, you can test your subject lines, you can test the content of your email, and different action sentences where you can link to your petition or to a call tool. So that's, email allows you to do a lot of that. For your texting SMS, you can have really urgent asks. SMS can also complement your emails in a lot of ways, or other tactics that you're employing, reminding folks by looking at the back end of things and seeing, hey, you didn't do this thing. I know you might be interested in this. Can you please take this action? Of course, it's a shorter format. And so you have to think strategically about making sure your ask is clear and concise. And that's similar to social media and to creatives. Those are also more shorter formats. And again, for social media and creatives, you can actually experiment with images for dynamic content like videos and GIFs. So that is a little bit about what you can do. And again, thinking about this and how, for instance, SMS can complement deep canvassing and listening sessions and different tactics that you're employing for your campaign strategy. And again, it's really important to use accessible language and images. You can't meet people where they're at if you're not even, using clear language. For instance, if you're trying to engage Black folks, like perhaps don't use images of white folks, think about who your audience is, who are you trying to reach, what are you actually trying to say. For instance, what I've learned from reproductive freedom folks is, instead of saying pro-life, you can say anti-choice, because what are you actually getting at? That they are, opposing people's access to freedom of their bodies. So being clear in your language. Again, with accessible language, don't use, acronyms that people don't identify with or won't necessarily understand. So things to keep in mind.
Great. And I'm looking at a lot of the responses from the Google form too. And this is awesome. Like the tactics, I see a lot of social media, a lot of email, field tactics, rallies, digital events, letters to the editor, geo-targeted social media ads. That's a good one. Car caravans, like there's just so many things on here. So I really love this. So thank you so much to all of you who submitted the form, and you can continue to fill out the form if you would like to. So yeah, talking about developing calls to action. So this has been mentioned a few times, but yeah, make sure you always have your messaging tied to a concrete action or solution. So like, what can your audience tangibly do? Like, is there something they can do to support certain legislation? But always like keeping in mind, like, what do our audience sees this message, and then what do we want them to do after that? So it gets them involved. So you're defining your goals, connecting it to your theory of change, like I've talked about, creating a powerful hook, making it personal. We've mentioned a few times about knowing your audience. And so what issues does your audience care about? I know with nuclear weapons, there's a lot of related issues like climate change and so many others. And so we kind of regularly like survey our audience and see what kind of issues that they care about, and are there like different entry points that we can make it personal for people? And also important to note is avoiding crisis and disaster talk. So overusing this like crisis frame tends to increase fatalistic attitudes and nurtures crisis fatigue. So I know this is something that I tend to struggle with when talking about nuclear weapons, is avoiding this like kind of fear mongering talk. And it's something that's really easy to do and is definitely overused in the field of like anti-nuclear weapons activists. It's really easy to talk about the problem. You know, it's terrifying. Like it's just this huge problem, but like we have to get away from that like problem framework. Like we can talk about the problem, but we have to say like, but wait, like there is something you can do, and it's supporting no first use legislation, supporting all these other things. So it's creating a way in for these people, and not just fear mongering and shutting people down because they're like, wow, this problem is so huge that I can't even do anything to tackle it. Using imperative verbs is important. Then these last three bullets are really important: making room for new approaches, inviting creative and non-traditional problem solving methods, using a variety of platforms and tools, and measuring and tweaking. So yeah, you want to test out a bunch of different things. Like you want to kind of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. So you can try out a variety of social media platforms for your calls to action. Try an email blast, try texting. What kind of different like tools are working? Like is like a write your rep ask working? Is a call your rep ask working? What kind of things are working on different platforms, and making sure that you're also tailoring those asks to those platforms. Like I know that if you're testing something out on like social media, for example, like Facebook tends to skew a lot older, more conservative, which is very different from Instagram, which skews a lot younger. Like TikTok, for example, is even younger. So you would tailor it to that platform very differently than you would for Facebook. And then ultimately measuring and tweaking. So when you throw all these things at the wall, like what is sticking, what is not working? Are people seeing your ask? Are they taking action? You can test out different designs. Like one thing that I like to do is testing out different emails. So like maybe try one email with a graphic, one without a graphic, test out different design for those graphics. And we call this A/B testing. So testing one thing against the other and seeing which one people see more of, and then seeing what causes people to take action more. So I think we can move on to the next slide. We're getting into storytelling. Yeah, so going off of developing calls to action, it's also really important to just like show these emotions and making proximate and like connecting with these emotions. So making it proximate, those are like messages that are personally meaningful to people, and it helps believers start a conversation, and it also attracts not quite yet believers through topics that matter the most to them. So like I said, with developing calls to action, like what does your audience care about? So I know at Beyond the Bomb, for example, like with nuclear weapons, like again, we've like surveyed our audience, and I know a lot of them care about like reproductive rights, for example. So how do you connect these two issues? Like it seems like something that wouldn't connect whatsoever. But there are connections between something like reproductive rights and nuclear weapons. Like when the US conducted nuclear testing, the last half of the 20th century, a lot of women were like adversely affected and still affected, and still face like birth defects and lack of access to healthcare. So it's seeing like what people care about, and then how do we kind of bring them into other related issues as well. And showing, not telling, so point to human stories, data that like people do support certain policies that we're advocating for. Elicit reaction. So using like a headline in the message that intrigues and appeals to our innate desire to protect others, or requires the reader to question their assumptions. So there's like something to take action against, right? And similarly with harnessing emotional intelligence, encourage people to take action against something, like against something that is unjust, unnecessary, unacceptable. It really brings out their like need to protect my community, my people, like something to take action against, right? And part of this is referencing those tangible human consequences. And I think we've mentioned this a few times, but like we're all in this fight for a better world for each other, right? So we have to bring up the stories of these frontline communities. Like that is ultimately why we're here. And similarly to like having people take action against something, like this is the bad guy that we want to fight against. We also need a hero of the story. Who are we fighting for? And those are people on the front lines that we are making the center of our story, those human tangible consequences. And there's a few ways to kind of connect with these emotions as well. So like I said, focusing on community is definitely more effective than making issues a personal or global issue, especially when we're talking about something like nuclear weapons. Like it seems like this like, you know, huge global problem that none of us have the like responsibility or like way to take action against, but if we're making this a community issue, it taps into our collective desire to protect those that we care about. Connecting through cultural relevance. So like, is there somebody that can be talking about this that may be reaching a different audience? Like I know one example is Mark Ruffalo. He really cares about different humanitarian crises. So I know he's worked with like One Without War and a few other organizations to put together videos about the war in Yemen. And so it's reaching a certain audience, taking somebody like him who has a huge audience. And so it's connecting through that cultural relevance, even just like artistic images and something that like fits in like social media feeds, talking about these like universal ideals as well, brings in a lot of different people. Keeping it ownable. I know Natebo mentioned this briefly, of just like keeping the message really simple, really relatable, able to be repeated. Like your audience can't own a message if they're struggling to retell it. So you have to be quick, you have to be straight to the point, you have to keep it really simple. Like stay away from jargon, stay away from acronyms. Like you just got to get right to the point, or they're not going to be able to come in and like help you in this fight. And then invoking hope. Like I said, fear mongering shuts people down. It shuts down innovation, protests, change. Going back to nuclear weapons, like I said before, it's really hard sometimes to get away from that fear mongering, but you have to kind of portray this world that we want. Like this is what we're working towards. We are working towards a world that is free of nuclear violence. Like that's what we are aiming for. And here's where we're at. Like we're close, we're getting there. Like it can happen. So it's invoking this hope and having people have a stake in this fight, and not just fear mongering and shutting them down. So taking another case study of the Essential Worker Bill of Rights, and I'll pass back over to Natebo.
Yeah, so for the Essential Worker Bill of Rights, again, this was a very robust, dynamic campaign that really was meeting the moment, as well as fitting into a larger, organizing infrastructure that's pushing for worker rights for, the U.S. compared to other countries. Our labor standards are not the same. They are not, meeting the needs of people as is. And so this is fitting into a need for that, as well as, mobilizing folks around the pandemic and what we, know essential workers are experiencing. And essential workers are a lot of people, millions of people. So, some of what we did is, actually made sure our messaging was meeting essential workers. We have a petition to Congress, and actually made sure that we, essential workers could indicate that they are essential workers and have space to actually speak on what they're experiencing. Again, Colleen talked about storytelling, making sure that essential workers are centered by being able to tell their stories as well as have, organizations help, labor organizations help drive the messaging around protecting essential workers. Um, as I mentioned, our target was the House and Senate, and this is a coalition of dozens of organizations, and not just labor organizations. Like, for instance, Daily Coast was a part of it. Greenpeace is a very active partner in the campaign. So just recognizing the intersection, so how all of our struggles are intertwined, and how we all aren't going to be free unless we address all of the harm that we experience and start to build a new world. And so for this campaign, it also fit into, like I said, fit into a larger push to improve labor standards in the US, as well as the push to meet all of our needs during the pandemic. So one portion of, the stimulus includes workers, but it also talks about healthcare and a lot of other issues. And so this had, we had to fit into all of that work and complement work that's already being done. And so once we actually had a victory in the House and got most of the key provisions of the Essential Worker Bill of Rights, it actually, was absorbed into a larger campaign. And the last thing I'll say is our tactics, even though that we are physically separated because of the pandemic, we were able to use social media to engage folks, to introduce folks to the concept of an Essential Worker Bill of Rights, using language that's familiar to folks in the US, the Bill of Rights, and also language around being an essential worker. Of course, all workers are essential, but this is like a designation that, became part of the vernacular of the country at the beginning of the pandemic. And then again, you see in the top image, this was a banner drop, so to speak, in direct action, that you see there's a mask on the lion, using imagery that we are all familiar with, wearing masks. Hopefully everyone's wearing masks. And, sorry that the image is smaller, but, sharing how many people have engaged our campaign. That's over 2 million people who have said we need Congress to address workers' rights and make sure that folks have access to childcare, etc. And then again, our image that we use, it has a variety of skin tones, and a pet peeve of mine is when people represent Black folks and use light skin tones. We're not all light. Also, that applies to, a lot of other groups. API folks, Asian Pacific Islanders, aren't all pale, so please don't just use pale skin tones in your creatives and your images. Make sure that you're actually representing what we look like. And so that's what we did for this particular campaign. For the graphic that you can see in the bottom, it's actually depicting what work looks like and has very clear messaging. Yes, let's keep going. And so, we have 10 minutes left for our presentation, and so I'm going to hand it over to Colleen to talk about resources.
Cool. Yeah, so we have this document that we put together, and I can drop the link to the PDF in the chat, which I will do right now. And we have cool cat gifs, of course. That adds a lot, to this presentation. So you can check out the link in the chat just for kind of a real quick PDF that outlines some resources, some articles, worksheets, trainings. But generally, I want to direct your attention to a few of these websites. So there's Social Movement Technologies, Equality Labs, and Mob Labs. So I would definitely check out all of these websites, like Social Movement Technologies, they have a lot of resources on their website. You can also do a lot of like courses and trainings with them. They have, I just got done with their digital campaigning like 9-month program, which pretty much covers like everything you would ever want to know about digital. They also have some like quicker like one-off trainings as well. Equality Labs and Mob Lab also both have a lot of great resources on their websites. I know Mob Lab I use all the time. Like it's anything from if you're just getting started, if you're just starting out as a campaigner, all the way to some more like advanced kind of digital tactics, and just in field organizing and just like building people power. Like that's really what Mob Lab is about. Equality Labs has a lot of good like digital security resources on their website as well. So yeah, I would just check out these three, but I've kind of highlighted like a lot of the main ones that I think are really great in this PDF. So like the ladder of engagement, building power, creating social media content. There's also an anti-doxing guide in there with digital security and just pointing to some trainings as well. Mob Lab has a lot of really great ones on like worksheets that you can like outline like calls to action and system maps and like developing a theory of change. Then I also just dropped in, we dropped in some articles on like one on like salience of issues. So that one's on nuclear weapons specifically, but it has a lot of really good information in there. So yeah, I just hope that that can be kind of a starting resource guide for people. And then like I highly suggest like checking out even more of these resources on the website. And yes, it's an interactive PDF, so you should be able to click on the links directly and it should bring you to the websites that are linked in there. So it should work. Let me know if that doesn't for some reason. But yeah, I think do we have questions we want to address? Santiago, I don't know if you see any questions.
Yeah, could you clarify what you mean by imperative verbs?
Yeah, so thanks Cecily in the chat for answering that for me. Realized that I should probably check my own jargon and actually explain what I mean by something like imperative. So yeah, exactly what Cecily said. So it's using like directive verbs. So like join this, sign this, act to do this, share this. So exactly like Cecily said, it gives people like a clear path of, like to do something through this call to action. So it's using these strong verbs. So yeah, thank you for asking that.
Yeah, and I also saw Emily agree Mark Ruffalo is quite a treasure, and I also have a crush on him.
Same.
But yes, it's very important to make sure that our images and our content are accessible. Like you said, Emily, jargon can be hard for folks to connect to who are neurodivergent. Another thing that has come up for me while creating graphics and such is making sure that the colors are accessible to folks who are colorblind, making sure text is large. And not, and something that I learned also in previous Netroots trainings is also making sure that folks can actually see the images. And we didn't do it in our presentation, but you can caption your images so that folks who might not be able to see the image can actually read what is it the content of the image or graphic. So those are things that you can also do. Feel free to drop questions.
I know in the meantime, I can kind of talk about some of the responses we got with our form as well. So yeah, it seems like a lot of the people in the call right now, a lot of national organizations, but also like state, regional, hyper local, international. We have some international, which is awesome. Yeah, a few state, few regional. Yeah, and I'm glad to see that nobody does not have a digital or field. So that's good.
Yeah.
Oh, you're unable to click on the list of resources. Okay. Yes, you can definitely email us. So I can put my email in the chat.
And if you filled out the form, we can also email you the slide deck as well as the resource guide. Yeah, for me, I've, worked at different places that have had, from, Daily Kos obviously has a lot of resources for digital campaigners, but I've also worked smaller operations that are, doing deep canvassing and, doing get out the vote work. And so I think it would be really exciting to have had some of the tools that we're talking about while doing that work. It's, a lot of times when you're canvassing, you're reaching people who are, sometimes you have to like go by foot too. Sometimes the locations don't necessarily have access to internet. So like, again, having flexible tactics to literally reach people where they're at is really key. And I think, sometimes with the few resources that we have, we're able to do a lot. And while some of the like different platforms and Google Analytics and things might not necessarily be as accessible, I think there's still a lot of things at your disposal, even without having a lot of money to do so. And so some of that is included in the resource guide. Yeah. Any other questions?
Seems like there's one in the chat.
Yeah.
Creating digital content along with your volunteers, aiming to have them flex their organizer muscles. If so, what has worked? Yeah, I love doing this. Like Beyond the Bomb has a fellowship program where we bring in a lot of young people from other kind of spaces to the anti-nuclear movement. And we've actually just completely pivoted to like a digital kind of fellowship starting in the spring with the pandemic. Like originally we had them like a lot in their community and organizing locally, but we brought it like completely online this spring and the summer. And so yeah, they're like creating social media content, they're creating graphics. We have them emailing their district with calls to action to call on their elected officials to support no first use or whatnot. They like we have them like kind of doing like a checklist of a bunch of different digital kind of actions that they can do on their own. And yeah, what has worked, like we do a lot of trainings with them. So exactly like what we're doing now is we do weekly webinars with our fellows and really try to give them as many resources as possible. And we have a lot of like guests in our fellow webinars, and this is our field manager, and a lot of our field team manages this program. But we do a lot of webinars with them, and it's really just about like the back and forth with them, and until they can get it right. Like we work with them one-on-one and in groups, and that's worked pretty well as well. And it can be hard to kind of go back and forth on something like, hey, this is like some feedback on your graphic, like when you're going back and forth over email. But I think they've learned so much, and I think they've really grown. And yeah, so that's worked pretty well with our fellows.
So a few questions for graphics and using a diverse array of skin tones. Some of the Canva, like, images and elements that are actual people, some of them that are already created, you can change the skin tone of. And so I encourage you to do that yourself. You should be able to do that even with a free Canva account. And then also, yeah, Nappy. So you can use different stock photos. Certain stock photo companies also have run their own campaigns to have diverse images. For instance, creating stock photos that actually center trans folks, so that way you are actually showing a diverse amount of people instead of just cis folks or what folks think trans folks look like, instead just actually having trans folks at the center of the images. And then for the recorded virtual trainings for volunteers, actually there's a great series of virtual trainings happening in the next month. So when I will make sure to email those, the link to sign up for those. They're going to be over the course of August to October, so I'll make sure to include those as well. Also, if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. And I'm happy, I do a lot of you know, ad hoc trainings for folks locally, whenever, you know, folks have questions, and you know, participating in digital skill shares. Momentum also has digital skill shares that you can sign up for. So we can also, I'll make a note to include that in the series. For those of you who are work for labor unions, I know that AFL-CIO also has a digital organizing, or an organizing school. And so if you're a union member, you should be able to access some of those. And those include digital tactics, as well as, you know, like canvassing and direct action and stuff. So yes, I can include my email. But again, if you filled out the form, we'll have your email and we'll proactively send these things out. But of course, if you have any questions, we didn't put our email in the doc just in case things get shared out further than we know. Again, digital security, very important. So very excited to meet y'all one day in person, hopefully in the next few years. Happy to see folks that I've met or am friends with in here. Very exciting. Any last questions? We can take questions for like 2 or so more minutes. Yes, the slides will be sent. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I included an email field in the form. I will, let me see, 1 second. So you can drop your emails in the chat if you want, but I also just updated the form to include the email field, and let me make it so that you can edit your response. Okay, so now if you go back into the form, you should be able to edit your response to add your email. So either drop it in the chat right now or in the form. Sorry about that. I thought I had added that. And just, I guess there's one more question about digital campaign collaboration. You know, Colleen and I work at 2 different organizations, and Daily Coast doesn't necessarily only organize around nuclear and, you know, no first use, but we are able to collaborate in coalition spaces. My colleague, you know, works with Colleen a lot too. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that coalition work, but in other spaces, you know, I'm part of different coalitions in immigration spaces. For instance, a Home is Here campaign around DACA, and also I participate in a Black immigrant working group, and so in that space, it's folks with a variety of backgrounds. There's policy folks, there's organizers, folks that primarily use digital tactics or primarily use field. And so those spaces there's a lot of collaboration and also sharing of resources. I mean, conceptually. So the coalition spaces, a lot of them are virtual. So that can be like an email listserv, and we might have regular calls, weekly regular calls to check in. And so it's not necessarily an online tool that I'm using in these different spaces, but to me, it's like a conceptual space. It's a conceptual community of organizers across organizations.
Yeah, we've used a few tools. We use Slack a lot. I know I'm on like literally like 10 different Slacks. Sometimes it's a lot, but it's a pretty good tool for collaboration. I've used like Basecamp before, it's called, for a few things. And like there's like message boards, there's places to share files. It's a pretty good way to organize it kind of in different ways. But yeah, I mean, if you also want to get involved with Beyond the Bomb at all, like I work a lot with Daily Kos, and we do a lot of like joint petitions. So there's been a few petitions we've done in the past, like Donald Trump wanted to resume nuclear testing because 2020 wasn't bad enough. So we kind of did a rapid response petition with Daily Kos. There's another one that we're in the midst of right now. It's called the Habakasha Appeal, which is the survivors of the atomic bombings in Japan are calling on the US government and other world governments to eliminate nuclear weapons. We've done that with Daily Kos, and they do a lot of petitions on a lot of different issues. So yeah, problem with Slack is everyone's already on so many. Yeah, I have that problem as well. Mural, I don't think I know Mural, collaborative digital workspace. I don't think I've worked with that one before.
Yeah, sometimes we use Slack, but a lot of them, because there are a lot of different people, sometimes it's easier just to be in a Google group. I'm very much in favor of keeping things simple. If you don't need Slack, then don't use Slack. Use what people are going to respond to. A lot of times in these spaces, what we do at the beginning is figuring out which tools work best for people. So sometimes it's a Signal chat, which is an end-to-end encrypted texting and call app that you can download on your phone. They also have a desktop version. So we use, it's not really necessarily tied to one specific one.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on the end of our time, but yeah, thanks so much for joining. And we'll definitely be in touch with the slides. I've written down all of your email addresses. So I hope to connect in the future, and definitely like email us if you want to work together on anything. And yeah, just thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. I can't wait to meet y'all again in another time. Hopefully we can work together.
Yes, maybe in person at one point.
Have a good weekend.
That was amazing, guys. Thank you for sharing and coming in today.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
No worries. That's all for us. Enjoy the rest of your week and enjoy the upcoming keynote today, even.
Yeah, I'll head over to that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Right.
Quick question, actually, for the recording, should we email anyone to get the recording of this? Or
I believe it should be sent to you. However, your primary contacts will be Eric Thutt.
Okay.
I believe has been the organizer with you guys. So just shoot him an email and he should be able to get it to you right away.
Awesome.
Awesome.
All right.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great day.
You too.